Good morning, everyone. Thank you for coming. My research is on Christian popular music. I am studying, this project studies essentially the ways that mainstream or mass markets and niche markets interact with each other. Some of the questions in general I ask are, what do they have in common, and where do they intersect, and where do they converge? When do they diverge? These categories, that is the categories of mainstreams and niche markets, affect the production, the mediation, and the reception of commercial music. And thus, understanding these categories is integral to better understanding music industries, both here in the US and globally. The central research questions that are kind of part of this particular project, I'm asking specifically, what can we learn about markets and their interactions from the focused ethnographic study of one specific niche market? So how might ethnographic data provide new perspectives and also nuance existing understandings of music industries? And much of the ethnography of popular music and music industries has been dominated by studies of musicians and artists, or of consumers and audience members. I'm more interested in the people in between the producers and the consumers. That is, the mediators, the people involved in record labels and magazines, marketing and public relations committees. So when I'm working with both for-profit and with nonprofit organizations, I ask what might constitute institutional ethnography best practices in the music industry. So there's a methodological kind of component to this as well. The methodologies I'm using include archival research, formal interviews with participants at record labels, oral histories with people involved in these scenes, and then ethnographic participant observation. As an ethnomusicologist, I believe that deep, contextually rich case studies, historical narratives, and qualitative data that ethnography produces can provide valuable insight that quantitative data often conflates. And so that's the point of doing this kind of deep ethnographic work. I'm considering markets, that is music industry markets, as fields of cultural production, which I take from sociologist Pierre Bourdieu. So I consider markets as bounded entities within which individual and institutional participants participate. They're relatively autonomous sociocultural networks of production and distribution mediation. They're structurally homologous, but they're not necessarily structurally identical. And in the larger definition, I would also include Pierre Bourdieu's subfields of restricted production that are not necessarily aimed at large-scale markets. That is, they're just smaller, they're subsets of a mainstream or mass market. So many of the niche markets in which we might be interested, that is, doing a focused case study, would fall into this category. Niche markets and mainstream markets are often related through a process that often gets talked about as mainstreaming. That is, a situation where something that was once niche then becomes available to a much larger or more mass market. And there are three types of mainstreaming that we can kind of identify by looking at these focused case studies. The first, at the top of this slide here, the niche values, the aesthetic and the ideological values, they shift closer to the values of the mainstream. The bottom is another kind of another example in which the mainstream's values shift closer to those of the niche markets. What normally happens, what my research has shown, is that over a course of time, decades usually, the values of both the mainstream and of the niche markets start to conflate. That is, they start to get closer together. And so we end up in this cycle where niche markets emerge with values that are kind of somewhat antithetical almost to those of the mainstream, and then over time they become closer and closer together. So why study Christian music? The Christian recording industry is more or less structurally identical, yet relatively separate from the mainstream recording industry. So it's got many of the same elements, it's got major labels, independent labels, and yet it kind of operates in its own little world. From an outsider's perspective, the boundaries appear to be easily definable. That is, if you ask someone who's not into or interested in Christian music if they could identify Christian music, often they might have some idea of what constitutes Christian music. It is easily historically bounded too. The modern Christian recording industry emerged as a vestige of the Jesus People movement, which you see here on this slide, a youth revival movement centered in California in the late 1960s. And these are some of the artists that were available at that time too. I'm done with my 5 minutes. I have one more slide to show you that I want to see. The boundaries that we can access by investigating niche markets like that of the Christian market. In the Christian music industry, we have this added dimension of faith that really kind of regulates the ways in which people intersect with the industry. So they ask, what is the primary purpose of this music? Is it for worship? Is it for entertainment? Is it for evangelism? Is it for something else? Who's the target audience? Is there crossover between this niche market and into the mainstream market? And as we investigate these boundaries, as I investigate these boundaries using ethnographic data, qualitative information, interviews, discourse analysis, it gives us a lot of tools we can then take to other markets that we can look at, both historically. For example, we can look at punk rock. How does punk rock change in the 70s and the 80s and the 90s and on? And it gives us some tools to investigate emerging niche markets in the current industry as well. So this is something that we do with our students too, ask them to really think about the ways in which what they're studying in the college can intersect with the different types of markets available to them. So thank you for your time.